Broadcasting live from the West Coast. This is John Gunnan, and I'd like to welcome you to another art history review with the goal of preparing you for the AP test. First off today, you know me, been around a few sessions here. I want to come right back to the question that Allison left you with the other day about Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun and Miguel Cabrera's portrait of Sor Juana. Okay, comparing the two. Today we'll spend a little more time comparing. It's a very important skill. We'll definitely spend time on that. So I hope that you chose number D, letter D, for the correct answer. It's in a more informal, natural posture. Okay, that is the correct answer. And in terms of resources today, I wanted to bring you this in case you haven't investigated. It's a wonderful glossary online, and it's done by a wonderful art history teacher, Jim Terry from Stevens College. And I'll give you an example of what you can find, but it just about has everything. If you're ever studying and you need to look up a word, it's a really great resource for you. Here you go. I looked up the word idealization because I found it in our show today. And if you had somehow forgotten or weren't quite sure about what that was, you could get a very succinct definition of it very quickly on the internet with Jim Terry's glossary. Okay, and I'm hoping that, well, of course you saw this, so you know right what it is, but on the AP test, there will be a couple of opportunities where a picture, you get a picture and you have to identify it. Of course, you know that you have to say two things about it. I would predict that artist and title, or title and culture would be the easiest two, but you can also talk about the media. You can even talk about the date, okay? This is a little game of Pictionary. I have a couple for you. We were playing it in class the other day, and I saved some of the ones that I thought were funny and fun. And of course, this one is Donatello David in your set. It's a good example of idealization, which we just talked about. Remember that Pictionary only goes until someone guesses, so therefore a lot of times it's doesn't go along that far. But if with that, hopefully you could get this, and you could say it is Caravaggio, The Calling of St. Matthew. We're going to come back and compare this to something today as well. Today we'll talk about painters in revolt. Painters as we move along through the set of later Europe and the Americas. And today, if you look at the skills 2A, you'll notice I bolded contextual elements, context, such an important part of art history. You really want to be able to say a little something about the context of all of the works. And that's quite a lot. And that's where you need to do a lot of your studying, because anyone can really analyze something visually. That's a skill that transfers very easily, but to be able to know something about context, very, very important. Okay, and then 2B, you'll see I bolded the words intent, purpose, and function. You know, why was a work made? What was it intended to do? These are really, really important things. Okay, so today we'll talk about context, and then we'll talk about how artists both documented their world and sometimes protested against their world, which is something a little bit new. Back in the Renaissance, you didn't have that much art that was involved with protest, social critique or protest. You'll also practice today explaining how both purpose and audience affected art making. Okay, so let's go to our first work. I'm putting it there with no identification, so hopefully in your mind you can identify it right away. And this is a document. You know, all of our paintings are really documents of their time, just like you have a document in AP European or AP World or AP US. You really can approach an artwork the same way. So what does this work say about its time and place? In this case, it is the Enlightenment, okay, that period that, you know, literature and thought and science, it was a intellectual renaissance, okay, in the 18th century. So this is Joseph Wright of Derby. They say of Derby because there was another Joseph Wright painter. It wasn't as important or long lasting as this one. So Derby is the town that he lived in England. The subject, philosopher giving a lecture at the orrery, which we'll see in just a moment. So just to give you this overall reminder about the Enlightenment, that reason was a focus, the belief that we could learn just about anything we needed to. Nature, by that I mean the observation, the empiricism and observation of nature, and the belief that progress was at hand and a positive thing. And of course, some of the thinkers on the right are people you know. I know I just saw a play by Voltaire recently. His plays are still being produced. So how does patronage change? Think back to the time of the Renaissance and the Baroque. What were the patronage situations like? You'll probably be saying to yourself, you know, the church was the patron, or a very wealthy family like the Medici, or the king. But in the Enlightenment, there starts to be changes in patronage. And in some cases, in the years to come, artists will even move away from patronage. Now, in this case, the patronage was a group, kind of a club called the Lunar Society. Okay, and if you're wondering what that machine is or that device, here is a nice photograph of an orrery. An orrery, of course, shows the orbit of the planets. And what I thought was interesting, it can even show and explain eclipses. And I know we've had some really exciting eclipses in the past years, especially the when you have a full lunar eclipse, which I've been able to see recently. I missed the solar eclipse 3 years ago. But I did see in today's paper that there's a incredible moon coming tonight. If you're somewhere clear, you can go out and look at the moon, be very, very close to the Earth, and therefore look big. So see, we're still interested in these things. So I'd like you to focus in on what the content is and what some of the important details are. You see this group of people. What does this tell you about the people who go to the lecture? And, you know, when you're in college, you'll have the opportunity to go hear lectures, and important people, authors and whatnot, come to your campus to speak. I know in my local library, we go to lectures a lot. So this is an important part of society in Britain at the time of the Enlightenment. People gathered to learn things. It was very valued. We see people of different ages, even young children. Okay, and of course, I think the young children make a nice comparison to the putti, or the little angels, in some of the paintings from times past. Okay, so you'll see here the composition too really highlights the philosopher and gives him almost a hierarchical status of importance by being the center, seeming to almost direct the action in the scene. Now, there's some speculation about who the model was. Perhaps he was a member of the Lunar Society that Joseph Wright of Derby knew, or some people think that he might be a model. The model might have been Sir Isaac Newton, and we're not sure. There's a lot of questions in art history like this, in all history, I should say. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to take a minute. And let's focus in on, hopefully these questions prompt some ideas. And when I say how is this emblematic of enlightenment? And then we sort of talked about children. Let's go ahead and talk about that. And then how is the philosopher deified or made to look like a god? And then finally, what does this artist borrow in style or technique from earlier artists? I'm going to give you about a minute to think of some ideas, and let's see if we can go a step further with this painting. Okay, so hopefully you would have some things to write about if you thought about these questions for an essay that you were writing. Now, let's take this last question. What does the artist borrow from earlier artists? Because I'm hoping this might remind you of an earlier artist, and that is the artist Caravaggio. Okay, so let's go to Caravaggio. Here are details from both paintings. I'm hoping that what you thought of was tenebrism and that sense of chiaroscuro, light and dark, tenebrism, that having that spotlight effect of almost like a theater of a spotlight shining on a face to highlight against a very dark background. Okay. So this is a kind of essay question I might give to a class. How do these works work in common to communicate a dramatic narrative? And as I say, it's the theatrical lighting. And in the case of the Caravaggio, it would be the sudden entrance, the hand pointing. Okay. Explain what the narrative is in each work. We know the philosopher is giving a lecture, but let's remember back. What is the Caravaggio work about? Okay. The men are in a tavern and there's drinking and maybe gambling, and the door opens. Jesus walks in and calls St. Matthew. Matthew gets up. Matthew remembers a tax collector. He gets up at that moment in his life and follows Jesus. Okay. So in the purpose of each work, the Rite of Derby is to commemorate the time of the Enlightenment and to call attention to this is the Lunar Society and the advancement of knowledge. The Caravaggio was in a church, and this was a time of the Counter-Reformation where the Catholic Church was really working hard to solidify their position and not let anyone turn to the Protestant religion. So it was a really exciting time for artists to put out this almost religious propaganda. And you can see here, the tavern is very plain, and it's the kind of place that common people would go. So it's really striking out for the common man. Okay, and of course, probably more people would have seen the one on the right, being a church. Identify this work. And hopefully you said Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. Okay, this is a work of Romanticism. There's a nice picture of Delacroix, and I want to take just a minute and talk about what Romanticism is. I personally spend a lot of time in Romanticism in my class because I like it a lot, and I always tell the students, be sure to give me a nudge if I'm still talking about it a month from now. So as we like to come up for things, ways to remember things, but Romanticism gets so broad and diverse that it took, let's see, all these letters to, talk about what it is. So this is just a device for students to remember, but I'll go through really quickly. Mysticism. Mysticism in some ways is a reaction against the Enlightenment, the emphasis on reason and rationality. So a lot of Romanticism really reacts against Enlightenment principles. Number two, outsider heroes. A hero that's maybe unpredictable. I always think of James Dean. Number three, imagination. Artists really go to new places, and because of this, the art of this time is very diverse and goes in very unique directions. The sublime, that mixture of terror and awe, and we'll come back to that in a moment. often associated with the natural world. Turbulent emotions. If you look up Romanticism on the web, you'll always see things like moods, feelings, exotic cultures, and exotic cultures that were produced to be even more exotic for European tastes often. And then finally, nature, and in some cases, almost a pantheism, or seeing spirituality through nature. These are some of the characteristics of Romanticism. And it's important to remember that not every Romanticism work will have all of these, maybe just one. So I'd like you to go back to this Delacroix painting that sort of is our emblem of Romanticism in the image set, and think about how it may be a romantic painting, but moreover, how this work describes this revolution, this revolutionary moment. Now, this was not the big first French Revolution, it was the Revolution of 1830, where there was a tyrannical king and the people of Paris rose up to overthrow that king. And if you look at this painting, you'll see different types of people. And the people are representative of different classes of people and whatnot that came together, especially if you look over to the right or the left, and you see one man who's clearly a worker, and then one man who's in a better stage in life, and not only wearing a top hat and a coat, but he's actually carrying a hunting rifle. And so this shows that the workers and the bourgeoisie really unified for this revolt, that it was not a revolt of just one class of people. And then you see the little boy on the right, and I always like to think of him as Gavroche in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Hopefully some of you have seen one of the Les Miserables productions. And the writing of Les Miserables, by the way, it came out many years after this painting, but Victor Hugo did see this painting, so I like to think that he was perhaps inspired by it. And then, of course, a good question is, well, why is a bare-breasted woman in the middle of this fray? And of course, the answer is she is an allegorical figure, that she is really not a woman, but a personification of liberty. And of course, she is giving a slightly classical look to harken back to the glory of the classical era. You can see Notre Dame Church in the background on the right. And also, let's remember the importance of the tricolor, the French flag of the three colors. And that flag would have been underground for some time as you had the Bourbon Restoration right before this. So we've kind of covered some of the allegorical meanings of this painting, and I want to just flash up the photograph of Delacroix, because you could see that he bears a certain similarity to the man there, and a lot of times artists like to subtly insert themselves into their own paintings like this. In a formal way, the painting is very different than the paintings that came before. And I want you to notice the type of kind of use of paint, brushwork, color, atmospheric effects that is going on in this painting. And then let's compare it to one that came a few years back before. So this work on the left was about 45 years before. So hopefully you look at that work on the left and you can identify it as The Oath of the Horatii by Jacques-Louis David. And if you just say David, that's okay, because that's the pronunciation, but I speak a little bit of French, so I say Jacques-Louis David. Okay. Each work has a narrative, a story. We just explained on the right that it was the groups of people rising up and blocking the streets and revolting against the monarchy in France in 1830. On the left, the narrative is you have to go back in time to a Roman story of two clans, and instead of fighting, they were going to have their best, they're just a couple of their best warriors fight each other. They are pledging an oath to defend Rome to the death. It's a very patriotic story. It's, although this was done in France, they're looking back to that time, and really it's the kind of painting that tells not only a story, but gives us an example of virtue, importance of self-sacrifice, patriotism. Okay, so moving down the line, identify a similarity, because when we compare, we're usually asked to show similarities and differences. And remember, you'll be asked to compare on your AP test this year. Okay, so the similarities for me is it's a moment in a play, or a moment in a drama, a frozen moment that is important in each one. And you could see on the left, it is really the moment of promise of what is to come, and you feel this somber thing. So again, I always like to relate paintings to movies and TV, because that's what we know so much of today. And think of these as, and of course, remember, movies are storyboarded. So it's fun to think about how a scene like this fits into the story, what's going to happen before and after. Okay. I think in difference, there's much more difference in how the works communicate the message, because one is so very clear and the other is so chaotic and free for all. A sense of this, dead bodies. It was really a different approach. So if they were movie directors, they would be very different. Audience of the time, on the work on the left, thousands and thousands of people saw this work because they marched through the Louvre Museum in Paris to see it when it was on display, and it would have made a big impression on them. The one on the right was also very inspirational picture for people to see. However, the kings in power were very aware of this. So the king would often not want this picture sort of to be out on view, where it got a wide reception, because it's too inciting of revolt. And so it has an interesting story on provenance, and that just simply means when and where it was displayed, and who owned the picture over time. Before we leave Delacroix, just going back to visit, the other day we were talking about Orientalism, and Delacroix had a trip to Morocco late in his career, and did sketchbooks and did paintings like this. And one of my favorite stories about this painting is it's a beautiful, wonderful painting. Is I had a Arabic speaking student, and I asked, well, what's the message on the wall? And they said, oh, it's just gibberish. So there was this production of what the exotic culture was like. So, and this is why I'm showing it, just to take you back to the Ingres Grand Odalisque for a moment. Okay, here we go. Another work associated with Romanticism. I would like you to identify this work. And hopefully you said The Slave Ship by Turner. Now remember that The Slave Ship is the short title for this work. It actually has the longest title, and the title indicates the narrative of what's going on in this work. And what's going on is that a slave ship was bringing slaves to the New World, and a fever broke out. Maybe it was like the coronavirus, people started getting sick, slaves started getting sick, and the slave captain could only collect insurance if he threw the people overboard. In other words, losses at sea was the only way. And so all these people were thrown overboard. This is a horrible, horrible story. This was an event that happened in the British slave trade. And so Turner at the time is really looking back on this event of maybe 30 or 40 years before this. But this work actually showed up in the hands of an abolitionist collector in Boston. So it has a powerful political message. And of course, when you see the work, it takes a long time, a lot of looking before you get into this thought. I always like to ask students, if this was a movie, what would be the score? Because the way the artist slants the horizon line, you feel like you're at sea with the swells rolling the boat, as if you're almost on another boat looking at this situation. If over on the left side where the boat is, the typhoon is coming on, it's almost as if the boat is about to get smashed. If you look down, is the true horror of this comes in, where you see a hand, or you see a shackle or a foot, and then you see fish. It's a truly horrible work. And this horror relates to that sense of the sublime, the mixture of terror and awe. I'd like to take a moment and compare the slave ship to another painting from United States at a comparable time in history. And I'd like you to think about what are the similarities and differences form, what are the similarities and differences in content. We've seen that the one on the left has a message of abolitionism because of this horrible moment, really pointing out a horror in history, almost like a journalist uncovering a horror and reminding people of something terrible that happened. But what about the one on the right? Hopefully you remembering this as the Oxbow by Thomas Cole. And then hopefully you are remembering that it is a story of manifest destiny, really, of developing the land on the left, and then or on the right, and then looking to the left and seeing the undeveloped land. And of course, there's a sense of storm, a smashed tree by lightning. There's a really nice comparison to the slave ship, the way the forces of nature are at hand, and the forces of nature are very indifferent to the world, and it's like the William Blake poem, "The tiger is of part of eternity, too great for the eye of man." How do we comprehend that power? And today, in today's world, with the fires and earthquakes, we know that these things are with us. Okay. Now, hopefully you can identify this work, very wonderful and important work. And just as Romanticism was kind of a reaction against Enlightenment, now we have a new style that is a reaction against Romanticism, okay? And that style is called Realism. And this work is reflecting the 1848 revolutions across Europe and the theories Marx and Darwin that were coming out, especially Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto a year before this painting was done. And that work, the Communist Manifesto, talked about the struggle of classes and how one class exploits another. Okay. And this work has a lot of social commentary, but it really, it was not the style of art that was prevailing at the time in Europe that people were paying money for. It was a strong political statement, but in terms of, it was not, it was an outlier in terms of art. So I think on this slide, there you can see it on the left, works that are making strong social commentary on the left versus the kind of works that we're selling to the public in the world of art. We call that academic realism. You see a mythology scene with a nude, and then you could see a history painting romanticizing the past down on the right. And these would be the kind of works promoted by the academies, the way that art was taught. So this work on the left was really more of artists that were outsiders and having their own social and political critiques. And the Stonebreakers, our work on the left, it's a fairly large painting, but the figures within the painting are monumental. And so when an artist did this kind of monumentality, it was shocking. Okay, so I hope that you are able to identify this work. And you'll see it, interestingly enough, this work was destroyed in World War II. However, it's such an important work that we have it preserved in facsimile. So I'd like you to focus in on it now and choose some of the details. Remember that on the AP test, it's very important that you don't talk in broad generalities about things, but when you can say something, but you have to kind of prove your point or prove your case in court by giving an important detail. So what are the actual details that are important in here? What do you notice as you see? One thing I notice is just the dirtiness of this scene and how their shoes and pants are don't look like they get a lot of washing. And then I noticed that the boy's shirt is torn. Okay, so this is obviously the poorest class. And you know, we really don't know this today, but Stonebreaker would have signified the sort of the lowliest job that you could possibly get. They took stones, they busted them up, and then they almost harvested the stones to make rock walls along roads and stuff. So it is a very hard job. Okay, so you know, you might ask it this way: what is this artist doing to make these people feel trapped within this world? Okay, because one of the things that Karl Marx wrote about was you know, the lack of opportunity for social advancement. So what does the artist do to make these people seem like they're going to be trapped forever in this kind of job, that they're not going to be able to go to college and get a better job? So one of the things you might be thinking is, well, it's like a father and son. So is that son doomed to stay in the same job that his father did? Okay, these are all really important questions for people were asking in 1849 when this painting was done. Some very nice details here. You can almost hear the hammer collaborating, you know, colliding with the rock. Okay, to look back, I wanted to talk a little bit about the word realism, because and sometimes people call Courbet social realism. You might see it like that on the internet or in a book, but because the Jacques-Louis David painting is in fact done very realistically. So why is this particular style realism? So what Courbet intended to do, Courbet and some of the other social realists, is they wanted to really show their world. So they wouldn't want to go back in time and paint a scene from history. They wouldn't want to paint a scene of an angel, because they never saw an angel. They would only want to see what they could observe and show the real world where it was. But to many of the patrons of art at this time, the real world was shocking and not something they wanted to see. There's a very nice self-portrait of Courbet. It's not in your set, but you can think about your other self-portraits that you know. This was a burial scene by Courbet, 22 feet long, with a big giant hole in the middle. So if you think about it, and I came to that word idealism at the beginning of the show when I was showing the glossary, he is an anti-idealist. There's many things he could have done to idealize this group of people, and he did none of them. Just made it look as blunt as possible. And believe me, Courbet was a shocking artist for people that saw the work. Okay, so I'd like you to briefly compare the works, the brushwork, the looks of the works, and then what message they have that might be related. Okay, these works were both revolutionary in a way. Now, as we come to the end of today, I wanted to jump ahead in time to another artist, Diego Rivera. And Alison mentioned him yesterday when she showed Frida Kahlo, because they were married. Diego Rivera was a muralist, and this particular work is in your set, Sunday Afternoon in the Dream of the Alameda Park. And this work is a incredible history of Mexico. And Diego Rivera took up the flag of social justice, just like Courbet cared about the poor, the advancement of people in life. Okay, and so I wanted to just take a moment and go through this some scenes from this painting. It's really a wonderful painting, and there's a lot to it. It's a history of Mexico in one painting, but in a way that's mixed up and remixed. And so I thought, though, that if you looked into this painting, that you might be able to find Sor Juana from yesterday, because she's sitting there in the painting near the beginning. And of course, on the very far left of the painting, you'll see a conquistador, and that is Hernan Cortés. And if you look closely, he has blood on his hands. You can find Frida, and oddly, Diego represents himself in the front of her as a little boy. The Alameda Park is a place in Mexico City, much like Central Park in New York, where people gather, they promenade, they walk around. And so in this case, he has figures from all of history walking around in this work, including some of the revolutionaries, different leaders of Mexico. And if you see the man on the horse with the sombrero, Emiliano Zapata, one of the Mexican revolutionaries. So yes, it's a work of politics, and it's a work about social injustice, but at the same time, it's a dream, and it's all mixed up. So for your exam practice today, I have a question about liberty leading the people. And if you think about it, this question is concerned with context, or content, I'm sorry, content and context. Today, our takeaways: We've seen painters from the later Europe and America set, and we've seen that painting moves along and that artists begin to work without patronage in some cases. I want to remind you that your AP test is coming online. And if you have a problem with technology, that you should get in touch with the College Board because they are there to help out. We're very excited about this coming AP test. We're going to be working hard to prepare you as time comes along. Students, this is John Gunnan signing off. Until next time.